And so once again, welcome to this webinar, which is hosted by the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport, or MCST. And this is one in our rolling series of webinars. We're building towards MEPC 82 in October, and the critical negotiations that will determine the basket of measures we adopt to drive shipping's decarbonization agenda out to 2050. As science keeps turning on the warning lights brighter and brighter, it is clear we really do need to get this right. There won't be time for second chance or plan Bs. This week, we're rolling out the lawyers. On May 21st, as many of you may know, the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea released its advisory opinion in response to two questions brought by two small island states, that's Tuvalu and Antigua. The opinion was unanimous, and the reaction from the legal blog sites and environmental activists around the globe was that this was an important legal event. The first time that an international court or tribunal has addressed states' obligations to combat climate change within the framework of ITLOS. Today, we are asking a panel of legal experts from the region and the international academies to dissect this opinion and discuss its relevance in the context of the negotiations at the IMO to decarbonize the shipping sector. The outcomes of the IMO negotiations have far-reaching implications for our region. They shape the regulatory landscape, influence international policies, and determine the pace at which we can achieve significant reductions in maritime GHG pollution. These negotiations are not just about setting targets. They're also about securing a livable future for our islands, protecting our marine ecosystems, and ensuring the well-being of our communities. We have the great honor of welcoming our Pacific Ocean Commissioner, Dr. Philemon Manoni, to ignite our discussion and challenge our panel with some compelling questions. Dr. Manoni is a powerhouse in ocean advocacy, celebrated across the Pacific and globally for his unwavering commitment to ocean governance and sustainability. As the Pacific Ocean Commissioner, he leads the charge in protecting our oceans, bringing with him a distinguished career, including Deputy Secretary General at the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat and Attorney General for the Republic of the Marshall Islands. His expertise also extends to his field as a legal advisor at the Pacific Islands Forum Fisheries Agency. Dr. Manoni, your leadership and relentless dedication are lighting the way for our island nations. We wish you well as you pick up the mantle of Ocean Commissioner on behalf of us all in our ocean. Sir, can I invite you now to set the scene for today's discussion and to pose some provocative points for our panel to ponder. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. It is a pleasure to be here at this very timely webinar. And I'm greatly appreciative that you have been able to organize this. I also extend my gratitude to the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport for bringing together this panel to discuss such a critical subject, which intertwines two essential areas of work at this pivotal moment. Both areas are likely to have significant implications for me in my new role, as they impact the health of the ocean, including its people and communities. These issues are complex and multi-layered, and I am eager to hear from our esteemed panelists today. On the one side, we have the evolving international jurisprudence on the legal status of climate change and the roles of states and international actors in addressing it. On the other, we have the practical implementation of these roles and responsibilities concerning shipping, particularly the work of the IMO in decarbonizing one of the most challenging sectors. Like many of my colleagues, I have been closely following both processes. The ITLOS advisory opinion is the first of several crucial legal opinions expected in the coming months, with the highly anticipated ICJ ruling on states' obligations due soon. This follows the adoption of an internationally legally binding instrument under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Additionally, discussions through the Intergovernmental Negotiations Committee for a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution envisages a successful conclusion at the next session. Furthermore, the WTO is also working hard to conclude the negotiations on the remaining issues related to the long-awaited fisheries subsidies agreement. From this, we see that a lot is happening in terms of high-level international legal activity around the ocean space. At the IMO, we are also nearing a major decision-making point regarding the level of ambition for decarbonizing shipping, the measures to achieve these targets, the pricing of greenhouse gas pollution, and the use of generated revenues to meet multiple objectives agreed upon by member states. So hopefully by this time next year, the IMO will have agreed on all these details. This is not an easy task. It is an immense one. And some might even say that it might be unachievable. But let us not be swayed. For us as ocean lawyers, the question is about the role of law and international legal framework, structures and precedents that we have established and continue to establish and refine through instruments and decisions such as the recent ITLOS advisory opinion. In these negotiations, we can go further and ask, what then is the role of law in the negotiations themselves? And what happens if the negotiations break down or fail to produce an adequate outcome? For my office, an additional dimension is what would the impact of such an outcome be on the health of the ocean? Given I am here as an advocate, certainly, but not for any particular side of the debate. Really, I am here for the ocean itself. In listening to the various commentaries since the ITLOS advisory was delivered, two camps of thought have emerged. On the one hand, there is a wave of highly positive and optimistic reporting, with the advisory being seen as a watershed moment and a pivotal development that offers stronger legal foundation for international climate action. It has been described as groundbreaking opinion on climate change that directly addresses state obligations for mitigating climate change and marks a historic first. Conversely, there are also other voices sounding a note of caution, viewing the ruling as conservative, achieved through compromise on key paragraphs, and offering little more than clarification of the obvious: greenhouse gas emissions as pollution, and a restatement of what the existing requirements and states' obligations are under the Convention. But there are several takeaways that this opinion provides that is relevant to the work at the IMO. But the key one perhaps, number one, that greenhouse gas emissions effectively constitute pollution, and as such, more relaxation by all actors is necessary. The second point is that states have a due diligence obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment from the impacts of climate change, with ITLOS considering this bar of due diligence to be a high one. The third takeaway is that measures should be determined objectively, taking into account the best available science and relevant international rules and standards. Fourth, the international cooperation, funding, technical assistance, and the establishment of scientific criteria for regulations are key. Large and wealthy nations have obligations to smaller and poorer nations. Fifth, the emphasis on the precautionary approach is another takeaway, where there are threats of serious, irreversible damage. A lack of full scientific certainty really should not be used as a reason for postponing effective measures to prevent environmental degradation and climate change. So at this point, John, you asked if I had some questions to share with the panel and your audience today. Well, let me challenge you here with these 3 questions. The first is, given all of this scenario, how do we view this set of circumstances? Is the glass half full or is it half empty? What impact does the ITLOS advisory have on the way that the IMO now approaches the final stages of the negotiation? Does it assist in achieving a high ambition to maintain the 1.5 degree, to promote just an equitable agenda, or is it a false hope? The next question is, the ITLOS is clear that greenhouse gas emissions from ships are in fact pollution. So what are the implications of this on the long-held Pacific position that revenues from shipping should be governed by the polluter pays principle? And finally, I note the strong ITLOS endorsement of the precautionary principle, which of course came to us via the Rio Declaration. The IMO strategy references a somewhat different version. So what are the implications in this scenario? So I leave you with those questions and look forward to the discussions today. But to conclude, I continue to find it remarkable that in both ITLOS and the IMO work, these significant efforts are purely driven by truly heroic champions from small island states. Tuvalu and Antigua leading the cause at the ITLOS, and the Pacific, now joined by seeds from the Caribbean and the Indian Oceans. At the IMO as well as the Pacific Law Students Initiative at the ICJ. For us, the intersection of ocean and climate change is where our realities converge. The nexus between climate and the ocean. I think that is an area that is what a focus. So this is the space where we must focus our efforts to ensure a just and equitable future for all. So colleagues, thank you for your dedication and collaboration. Let us stay united in our efforts to safeguard our oceans. And John, thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to the insights from the panel. Thank you again. Inaka, Komol Tada, and Sulang.
Mahalo apito, Dr. Philemon, insightful and provocative as always. And now we have our 3 questions from our Oceans Commissioner. But before I do that, I would like to present our distinguished panel today. And I think it's easier if I ask our panelists to introduce themselves. But as you introduce yourselves, I'd like you to also help answer this question, short question. So I'd just like to ask briefly how you all feel about the outcomes of the advisory opinion. Is it a boon for small island states? I think I'll start with Ms. Athena Schutz. Atina, could you please introduce yourself and also share some thoughts on the question or starting question? Thanks, Atina.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone. I also want to thank the Ocean Commissioner for providing us with his opening remarks, but also for those really insightful questions. So my name is Atina Schutz. I sit with the Marshall Islands delegation in the IMO, and I'm also a legal researcher with the MCST. It's one of my affiliations. So before I start, I just want to say what an honor and privilege it is for me as an early career lawyer to be sharing a panel with some very distinguished and experienced panel of professors and academics talking on a topic that is of very big interest for me. So yeah, thanks for having me. In terms of takeaways, I do have a few takeaways from the advisory opinion. But and there are many, it's quite broad and it covers many different aspects, but for this particular webinar, I'm just going to focus on the ones that relate to the IMO negotiations. So for first and foremost, and I think this has been echoed everywhere in almost every single commentary, is the declaration by the tribunal that GHG or greenhouse gas emissions is considered pollution. So that sort of activates all the provisions in Part 12 of the convention with respect to the obligations of states to protect and preserve the marine environment, but also to prevent, reduce, and control pollution. So that's the big thing for me. Then one is so the tribunal also did some discussion on Article 211, which talks about international rules and standards and the need to make national legislation. So that the part that it references that as national legislation having to have at least as much effect as international rules and standards, which is established by the competent international organization. And another takeaway is also the IMO sort of being recognized, written in, spelled out in that AO as the competent international organization. And finally, for me, it's the standard of due diligence required of states in reducing GHG emissions, and that it's sort of declared to be one of stringency, or to be stringent. So that's it for me. Thanks, John, for giving me the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Hi, John, you're muted.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Hello. Thank you for reminding me that I'm muted. Sorry about that. Thanks, Atina, for your answer. I think we'll move on to Professor Beatrice. Beatrice, could you please introduce yourself and just briefly, how do you feel about the outcomes of the advisory opinion?
So my name is Beatrice Martinez. I work at the University of Copenhagen at the Faculty of Law, and I'm associate professor on environmental and climate change law. And I head the Center for Climate Change Law and Governance. So to the question whether the glass is half full, half empty, which I think is the one is what really caught my eye. I think at the very least, the glass is less empty than it was. And together with what Atina said, I think the fact that the advisory opinion states that the obligations of the states under UNCLOS go beyond the climate change commitments is also a big advancement. The fact that there's a big consensus on science and the acknowledgement that developed countries should or must take the lead as well is for me another takeaway of the decision, or an important point of on the advisory opinion beyond what Atina has already explained.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I'd like to move on to Professor Aldo. Professor Aldo, could you please introduce yourself? Just a brief answer on how you feel about the outcomes.
Thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me. So my name is Aldo Kirkhope, and I'm a professor of law at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And I'm joining you today from Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral land and territories of the Mi'kmaq Nation. So my initial reaction is actually a positive one. So I'm in the positive camp. And I feel that the small and developing states should feel empowered by this advisory opinion, because it sets out specific obligations in the law of the sea for states to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment arising from climate change and ocean acidification. And I would underscore that these are their obligations under the Constitution for the World's Ocean. More specifically, I think there are specific contributions that this milestone advisory opinion has made. I think most importantly, it has developed a comprehensive approach to what are interconnected obligations of states across different legal regimes to clarify what ought to be compatible obligations. Obligations under climate law, for instance, the UNFCCC, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, under maritime law, MARPOL, under the Civil Aviation Convention as well, the Chicago Convention, general international environmental law, the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as a mention of CITES, as well as other law of the sea instruments, such as the Stradling-Stokes Agreement. It essentially created a harmonious approach to interpreting all these obligations and bringing them under the umbrella for the purpose of protecting and preserving the marine environment from GHG emissions. I think another important takeaway is the reassertion of equity in international law. And basically that in the context of marine pollution from anthropogenic GHG emissions, states with greater means and capabilities must do more to reduce such emissions. And but at the same time, noting that states with less means and capabilities basically ought to be given appropriate recognition in reference to their own capabilities and so on. Another important dimension to this, I think, is the clarification of the standard of due diligence expected of states. So mostly, I think, developed states here to act not only with due diligence, but also according to a standard which is described as stringent. So a high standard of due diligence and in good faith, especially with respect to what are continuing obligations. So not one-shot obligations, but continuing obligations, such as the duty to cooperate. So those to me are the immediate sort of first impression of important contributions of this advisory opinion.
Thank you very much, Professor Aldo. I'll now move on to Professor Pierre-Jean. Professor Pierre-Jean, I'd like you to introduce yourself, but I will begin by asking you an aspect of the questions from the Commissioner, which is what impact does ITLOS have on the way IMO now approaches the final stages of negotiation? Does it assist a high ambition 1.5 degree just and equitable agenda, or is it a false hope? Thanks, Professor.
Talofa, John, and good evening also. PJ, Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport, and sitting with the distinguished delegation of Tuvalu at the IMO. So you tricked me there because I was prepared for the other question, John. But no, but in 2 words there, I just wanted to say obviously that I totally subscribe to all, and particularly the extensive answer given by Professor Kirkhope. In relation to the half full, half empty, I just wanted to add something. There's one thing where one could have hoped, but I think it would have been very hard for ITLOS to add in relation to the IMO issue on greenhouse gas. You know, those emissions are international emissions, and so they are not state emission as such. And this is where, you know, when the question was asked to ITLOS to precise, you know, the state obligation. This is where there is a bit of missing link there and gap, and so one would have hoped that maybe the tribunal could have created something, but it would have been really difficult. But there was some interesting elements there about climate change is a common concern for mankind. So the reaffirmation of that, and also, you know, the duty of state to cooperate. So there's some doors there to build on. So to come back to your question, so what does that mean for the negotiation at the IMO? I think the positive, I think one of the elements where at which everyone is looking at is the reaffirmation of the approach or precautionary approach. I wouldn't be overly enthusiastic about that, because precautionary approach is just a legal tool. And so all depends on how it is used. And so if you use that tool wrongly, I think that could have the counter effect. Like, for instance, if you try to bring the precautionary approach in contesting or challenging every single measure, you might actually could end up delaying things. So it's a note of caution also here. So I don't know if I hope that has helped to answer your question, John.
Yep. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Pierre-Jean. I'd also like to ask Professor Beatrice the same question. What impact does ITLOS have on the way IMO now approaches the final stages of the negotiation?
So the fact that the obligations of the state regarding climate change have been clarified there maybe might help countries to decide one way or another in terms of ambition. Then the issue of due diligence, that's also doing as much as you can, and the decision, the advisory opinion really highlights that in a number of occasions. And then probably the issue of equity and developed countries taking the lead, and that might have also an impact on the design of whatever measure is in the end, and the way that the revenues will be redistributed. Yeah, also regarding the precautionary approach, the advisory opinion doesn't really change much the legal status that the approach has in international law, and in that connection, although it's could achieve the level of the status and the bindingness that other principles of international law have, this is not yet the case, although it's an item, a concept that is under development. So supports that, but I don't think it's really a game changer in that way.
Thank you very much for your answer. I'd like to turn now to Ms. Atina Schutz. Do you think that the advisory opinion assists a high ambition position, which is 1.5 degree? Does it also advance a just and equitable agenda, in your opinion?
Thank you, John. And wow, that's a really tough question. And it's quite a lot to unpack as well. For me, the fact that the court, I want to go back again to the due diligence, the standard of due diligence required. So the court mentioned that it's a stringent one, so it has a very high bar, and as Beatrice has already mentioned, states need to demonstrate that they are doing all that they can. And for me, in terms of how this relates to like IMO negotiations, which is one way that for small island states, that's another four that we're trying to push for a 1.5 aligned pathway in terms of emissions from a specific sector. I would translate that as sort of requiring states to make sure that they are doing all they can to make sure they pick the right measures that are effective, that actually does the job. And it's also one that accomplishes the requirements that have been set out in international rules and standards as agreed to agreed to within the competent international organization, which is the IMO. And when I refer to the international rule, I'm specifically referring to the revised strategy that was adopted by the IMO in July last year. And when developing, and the committee, the Marine Environmental Protection Committee, agreed that the adoption of market-based measures, or consists of like an economic element, but also a technical element. It also highlighted the three types of the three requirements that these must fulfill, which is the incentivization of the fleet, incentivization of the transition, the environmental effectiveness, and also contributing to a just and equitable transition. So when states, and I just want to reiterate, I just want to point out that revised strategy was sort of adopted unanimously. It was a huge at the IMO. So basically states have sort of committed to that. And what this advisory opinion is saying is, we now have to exercise due diligence in carrying out those the obligations that we have agreed to within that revised strategy. So I think it's really positive that the court's saying that we now must do everything we can. We need to pick measures that are that carry out those standards and requirements that all of us have agreed to at the IMO. That would be my contribution. Thanks.
Thanks, Athena. And now I turn to Professor Aldo. Is the glass half full or half empty for you? And I asked the same question as well as I asked to Athena, whether this assists a high ambition 1.5 degree just and equitable agenda at the IMO, or is that just a false hope? Thanks, Professor.
Yeah, I wouldn't use that metaphor. I tend to think more in terms of how far have we managed to progress with this judgment in helping clarify the state of international law in a comprehensive manner. And I think this decision has made actually a rather important contribution there. So to me, from the perspective of clarification of obligations within the context of the law of the sea, but addressing GHG emissions as a form of pollution, I'd give this judgment very, very high mark. So certainly not, I would not stop at the half mark at all. It seems to me too that Athena is absolutely right. I think this judgment has provided, I think, important legal arguments to essentially raise ambitions, because it's not simply a duty to cooperate and essentially a duty of conduct to try one's best, a duty to endeavor. No, this is something more than that. What the tribunal said, basically, that due diligence obligation means that states, given the urgency, given the nature of climate change, they should be doing something more. So that high level of that word stringent suggests that they're under the microscope now. So essentially, there is a legal obligation when they enter negotiations to aim for something more than simply negotiating at the table. Of course, turning perhaps to an earlier question that you posed in relation to the IMO, one tricky thing at the IMO is that the IMO delegations don't like to talk about the law of the sea. But they are confronted now with an important decision which brings in their obligations under the climate law, maritime law, and other international environmental law instruments, essentially under law of the sea obligations that they cannot ignore. I can't see how those deliberations at the IMO can ignore essentially these additional responsibilities when states and the IMO itself has been named as an organization that has a special role to play. So it seems to me that for the SID states, there is now a strong legal argument to say, look, we've got this advisory opinion. This suggests that between the high level of due diligence and the need, strong endorsement of the precautionary approach, that the ambition should be higher rather than lower.
Thank you very much, Professor Aldo. Also, I'd just like to remind everyone what to say that if you have any questions at any stage, please post them in the chat or just any comments, and we'll address them after we've gone through the 3 questions from the Oceans Commissioner. And since Professor Aldo, you're warmed up, I guess I'll move on to question 2, and I'll pose that to you first. So clearly, ITLOS is now clear that GHG emissions from ships are pollution. So what are the implications of this on the long-held Pacific position that revenues from shipping are governed by the principle of polluter pays? So what's your take on this?
Okay, so what we have to bear in mind too here is that the tribunal did not address the polluter pays principle. And the reason for this is because the decision really focused on primary obligations, not secondary obligations. Secondary obligations are the remedies once there is failure to perform a primary obligation. And indeed, the commission itself, when it was asked by the tribunal to clarify what was it that it was actually asking in its 2 questions, the commission made it clear that they really were focusing on primary obligation, not secondary obligations. But having said that, it's interesting to note that the tribunal, in interpreting Article 1941, which essentially imposes a legal obligation to take all necessary measures to prevent, reduce, and control marine pollution from anthropogenic GHG emissions, including measures to reduce such emissions. The tribunal also said that if a state fails to comply with this obligation, international responsibility would be engaged for that state. So what this suggests is there remains a lot of room to argue here that the remedial dimensions of the polluter pays principle could well apply to greenhouse gas emitters. So I would think that this actually helps the long-standing SIDS position. What we don't know, though, is essentially what would those remedies be, because the tribunal was not asked to clarify what those remedies are, and therefore there's still an open question there.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'd just also like to ask perhaps Professor Pierre-Jean if you could share your insights on that question as well. Or do you agree with what Professor Aldo said, or do you have any additions to that?
Yeah, thank you, John. Yes, absolutely. I think really one of the big takeaways is the deliberate effort, clearly very ostensible effort of the tribunal to try to reduce this fragmentation of international environmental law and trying to link all those different regimes, as Professor Kirchhoff mentioned. Now, when it comes to obviously the principle of polluter pays, as Professor Kirchhoff mentioned, that's a secondary obligation, and so. But the fact, as he mentioned, that there is an opening door there is quite important, and this is in the context also of this principle being upheld by the IMO in different contexts on different in different conventions. So. This is something that where you can see almost a ratchet tightening over state obligation, and so a regime being precise, more precise these days. So I think overall there's some positive things here.
Thank you, Professor. I'd just like now to turn to Ms. Athena Schutz, if you wanted to weigh in on this question on the polluter pays principle.
Thanks, John. To be honest, I think Professor Kirchhoff and Dr. Portahandy have covered that quite well. But I did just want to pick up on something that Dr. Aldo had mentioned, which was the ITLOS, or the tribunal, not touching on the remedies or the consequences. I just wanted to point out, we do have another upcoming advisory opinion, which is from the International Court of Justice. And in fact, the second part of the second question posed to the ICJ is, what are the consequences of breaching? So, I mean, of course, the ICJ is being asked to outline obligations as well, and we expect that it's going to be, pretty similar or mirror to what ITLOS has already said. But it also goes further by adding, what are consequences for breaching those obligations. So I think that's one thing we can definitely look forward to reading once it does come out. But yeah, that's all I wanted to just add on. Thank you.
Thanks, Athena. Okay, so I'll turn to Professor Beatrice now, and I'd like to ask you the third question from the Oceans Commissioner, which is, so noting that the strong ITLOS endorsement of the precautionary principle came to us via the Rio Declaration, the IMO strategy references a somewhat different version to it. So what are the implications of this?
So, I mean, we already commented a bit on the precautionary principle. So, yeah, it's endorsed, but I don't think it's a game changer the way that maybe other parts of the advisory opinion are. Already the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea endorsed the precautionary approach in a previous advisory opinion on the seabed. And I think it's relevant because it's just like the next step on the principles that deal with harm prevention. So precaution is like the next step, and it's good that we get decisions to advance on that. And I think for the climate change regime anyway, the precautionary approach is quite embedded into the principles that guide the UNFCCC and any development under that. As for the IMO, even though they are taking IPCC as signs of the IMO and they're doing the report, so there's some kind of connection with in line with precaution, I think, more and more. So it might help raising ambition and the issue of urgency that is on the advisory opinion repeated once and again. Yeah, that might be relevant. Also, I think it's interesting that all greenhouse gas emissions are considered marine pollution, and that opens for more than just like carbon pricing at the end.
Thanks, Professor Beatrice. I'd just like to now turn to Professor Pierre-Jean. I'll ask you the same question.
Yes, thanks, John. I think there is something, very interesting in addition to my comments in relation to the precautionary approach being a tool and having to be used properly. There is a specific implication, I think, of the ITLOS decision in the way it is upholding the precautionary approach on the negotiation at the IMO, because the IMO adopted a couple of years ago a circular where it sort of defined the precautionary approach in the complete opposite way of what the precautionary approach actually means. And so that probably would be a good opportunity to go back to the IMO. I don't know if it's going to be the legal committee, and to ask them to revise their circular defining what precautionary approach, because it is defined in a way that it requires absolute scientific certainty, basically, before you start to move. So it's a science-based approach there. And so that could be a good justification to revise that circular. I think it's a circular or resolution. I don't have the number on top of my head right now, but I think this would be probably the most definitive impact of the ITLOS advisory opinion here. Thank you, John.
John, can I add a point on that, actually, because this is a really important point that Pierre-Jean has made. Basically, what was referring to is resolution MEPC 6737. And indeed, this was adopted quite some time ago by the IMO to explain its precautionary approach, but it was adopted in a very narrow context. They were thinking in terms of essentially other types of pollution. They did not think at all about climate change. And I think the point made by Pierre-Jean is very important, that the IMO guidelines here on precaution indeed are limited because they include qualifiers such as cost effectiveness, and that precaution would not be considered in isolation of other IMO practices, procedures, and resolutions. So immediately really putting it in a box, as it were. And I would totally agree that it's the time has come to review those guidelines against the larger backdrop of climate change and the role of international shipping in mitigation. I think it would be helpful to impress the need for urgent climate action in the IMO's approach to the precautionary approach.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Aldo. I think I'll turn to Atina as well. She has anything to add on this question?
Thanks, John. I think the distinguished academics have covered everything, but thank you.
Okay, I'll just pose my own question at this point. Could one of the panelists, could they comment on the concept of environment in international law? Does it include people and communities? Does it include future generations? And is the ITLOS advisory opinion changing anything in relation to that? So maybe Professor Beatrice.
Future generations.
Yes.
So there's the issue of equity, and that includes intra and intergenerational equity. I'm sorry, I lost the question. What was it? It's like 10 o'clock.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I agree. So if you could just comment on the concept of environment in international law and whether this includes generally people and communities and future generations, and what the ITLOS advisory opinion changes in relation, anything in relation to that.
Yeah. So the environment per se, although there are certain moves to protect, personality of rivers and things like that, but it's really for what it serves humans. So in that connection, it is intrinsically understood in international environmental law as part of this anthropocentric, if you like, perception of that. Definitely, I mean, the issue of future generations, we can see that in the advisory, we can see it in many other cases, tribunals and decisions that are happening. So that's definitely an important aspect of climate change, but also the oceans and our environmental matters. And you have 2 questions on the chat.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll move on to the questions in the chat after I pose Professor Pierre-Jean this question. So, how much progress has the advisory opinion achieved in terms of increasing cohesion of international environmental law?
Thanks, John. So I think it might take some time to really measure the impact and maybe also assess how states are going to adjust their own customary understanding of their own obligations. So I think it might be a bit too early to give an answer to that one. It'll take a time to unwrap, I think, and really understand what are the definite impacts of this decision. Particularly because, as I said, the state might really adapt and revise what they think is their obligations. I hope that helps.
Thank you, PJ. Sorry for throwing that question at you. Okay, I think I'd like to move on to questions in the chat now. I see some questions coming up there. The first question from Pete. Can ITLOS be asked a follow-up question on the status of the polar pace at IMO? I think maybe I'll start with Athena on that question.
Yeah, thanks, John. Sorry, is this a question being posed by in the chat by Kyler?
No, the one before.
The one before that.
Can ITLOS be asked a follow-up question on the status of polluter pays at IMO? Well, I think there is a provision where states can request an advisory opinion from the tribunal. But there are some requirements that must be sort of covered before that does happen. But in terms of like advice, if my personal take on this is if it's a question that really has to be asked and it's the right time for it, and if the context and the situation is perfect and ripe for it, I would say go for it. But of course, this is just my idealistic take, but I would really love to hear the perspectives of the other distinguished panelists on that question as well.
Thanks,
I can
Athena.
be the devil's advocate. Yeah, on this one. The way Peter has framed the question is very interesting because he did not pose it as a question of general international law, which would easily fit as a question which can be carried in the form of an advisory opinion, a request for an advisory opinion to ITLOS, but rather polluter pays at the IMO. So it would relate to an activity, a function, an interpretation of work at the IMO. And I'm wondering if in that context, this might require instead potentially a different route or an alternative route, let's put it this way. And this reminds me of the advisory opinion concerning the membership, the 1960 advisory opinion concerning membership of the council at the IMO, and concerning the interpretation of a specific issue concerning composition within the IMO convention. And because the IMO is a specialized agency of the United Nations, therefore, the route to get that assistance was through the International Court of Justice following a request from the UN General Assembly. So that was a particular route adopted at the time. So this was 1960 and so on, because it concerned the specific function of the IMO itself. So I'll put that on the table put it forward as potentially a different route from going to ITLOS.
Thank you, Professor Aldo. I hope that answered your question, Pete. I just take the next question from Kyler. Hey, Kyler, how are you going? So his question was, if I may, will ITLOS outcomes affect the GHG negotiations, or are they both dependent on each other? If there are no dependencies, do outcomes from ITLOS broaden the international framework for environmental protection measures? I wonder if one of our panelists would have a quick answer to that question off the top of your heads. I'll start with Pierre-Jean.
Yeah, I think we've turned around that one actually. That's the one from Kylo, right? Yeah. So yeah, I think we turn around on that one. I think it's all interdependent, and that's why the ITLOS advisory opinion is actually considered partially tonight. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Maybe if Professor Kirkhope wants to add.
Yep. Beatrice, did you want to add anything to that?
So the ITLOS outcome will affect the negotiations, yes. Are they both dependent on each other? No. Does ITLOS broaden the international framework for maritime protection? In a sense, because it states that greenhouse gas emissions are marine pollution, and in that way clarifies and opens for, as I said, more than CO2. And then the fact that also oceanborne energy put in the ocean in that way is also considered a way of pollution that might also open for other items. Yes.
Thanks for that. Yeah, Kyler, I hope that answers your question. I'll just move on to the next question, and I'll give it to Pierre-Jean. So is MEPC limited to only considering emissions from ships, or could they also regulate and limit the shipments of pollutants like fuel oils? Is cargo oil only a pollutant when it is emitted or spilled?
All right, so this one is actually much easier because there are a regime for pollution by oil, and I'm sure that Professor Kirkhope also would be more than happy to detail that. That could take a long time actually, because there are different regime whether the oil is from bunker oil used as a fuel, or whether the oil is a cargo. Different regimes, different level of liabilities, and different level of covers, and depending the size of the ship and so on. So, but basically, this is covered and this is addressed, and there is both aspects of pollution prevention through MARPOL and pollution compensation through other regimes. So this is all done, and MEPC and legal committee have both responsibilities, MEPC for MARPOL and legal for the others for liability. So in a nutshell, and I hope I haven't said any silly things, so please, Professor Kirkhope, just correct me if I say anything wrong.
No, that's correct, actually. I think what we have to bear in mind here is characterizing a particular commodity as a pollutant does not necessarily make pollution. Pollution is when there's spillage into the marine environment. So there are all kinds of cargoes that are potentially pollutants, not just oil. There are thousands, literally, of dangerous goods covered by the International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code. And yes, the IMO actually regulates its safe carriage. So, so in a sense, your answer to your question is yes, pollutants or commodities, if you want, that are potentially polluting, they are released in the marine environment, and their safe carriage is also regulated. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Aldo. As many of you know, we started late, so we'll give ourselves another 5 minutes. And with that, I think I can move on to Andrew Friedman's question. He says, I think Professor PJ started to raise this question, but did the tribunal give guidance as to which country is the polluter when flag ownership, port, and others may all be different? And what obligations do they have to take national or regional action in the event the negotiations fail? I think maybe Professor Aldo, if you have any views on that question.
It's an excellent series of questions. I think what is important to underscore here is that the tribunal in this advisory opinion, again, reiterated an earlier advisory opinion, the SAR-FC advisory opinion, concerning the duty of flag states to exercise effective jurisdiction and control over their ships. So I think it is very important. So when we're thinking about which country is the polluter, Well, we have to think in terms of the jurisdiction. So the state that is able to exercise jurisdiction and control over their ships. So they have particularly important obligations. And maybe, Pierre-Jean, you might want to comment on those, because I know that's something that you're interested in. Yeah, and maybe I'll pass the ball back to Pierre-Jean. Did you want to comment a little bit more about the flag state part of this?
Yeah, the flag state responsibility is a challenging one. So it's a very complex one, and in some aspects also very sensitive. There are precedents where, you know, with the Deepwater Horizon pollution, you know, the flag state was pointed, for instance. But so far, I think I don't think there's been a case where really the flag state was blamed for one type of pollution specifically. But yeah, these type of questions definitely need to be considered more deeply. I agree. So yeah, but yeah, very based debate.
Thank you both for those answers. I think we have 3 more minutes, so maybe if either Athena or Beatrice had any views on any of the 3 questions that were posed, that you could share.
Like closing comments or...
Oh, closing comments. Yes, let's go for closing comments. We'll start with you, Professor Beatrice.
Yes, thank you. So just because it's the last time I intervene, thank you so much for the invitation. And maybe just as a closing comment, highlight again that it is important that these arguments are, as Aldo was saying, transferred into the realm of those negotiating and taking care of the IMO, because it's no longer possible to ignore that any measure taken on greenhouse gas emissions is not only about IMO, it's also about law of the sea, it's also about other realms. So this interconnection or interconnectivity between different areas of law is very important. And also the fact that environmental principles of international environmental law and norms of international environmental law are becoming more and more relevant for what is happening at the IMO. And we also need to think, and the advisory opinion mentioned that in a way as well, that this is a complex environmental governance issue, and states, of course, are the main recipients of that and the main actors of that, but there are also other actors that are very relevant, and polluter pays principle can also refer to those actors. Yes, I think those are my final comments and thoughts.
Thank you very much. Athena, do you have any closing comments?
Thank you, John. Yeah, sure. Just in terms of closing comments, just wanted to just reiterate, you know, that this advisory opinion is, you know, a good step forward. It's really great to see clarification and, you know, in some cases confirmation of some of the arguments or ideas that some states have been saying. So it's really good to see that written on black and white from the tribunal. I also note that, you know, advisory opinions, you know, although they're not really binding on states, but they do provide, you know, strong authoritative guidance on, you know, applying and understanding laws and our various obligations under international law. And, you know, I also want to note that, you know, it's also a very rich opinion that was given. It covers various areas as well. And I think, you know, we should really do as much as we can to, you know, implement them and, you know, really utilize them in the various forums that we are in. So that would be my closing. Thank you.
Thanks, Athena. I'll now come to Professor Aldo for his closing comments.
Yeah, of course, the big question is, now we have this advisory opinion, what to do with it? And it seems to me that there's an opportunity here for the states at the IMO to bring it to the attention of the IMO in a formal manner, but to do it in a practical way in the form of a brief, which is a punchy brief, that essentially makes it clear that this is applicable law to the negotiations underway at the IMO. I think it would be very difficult for delegations to ignore it if it is proposed essentially as applicable law to the negotiations. And one, of course, which, as Athena said, although the advisory opinion itself is not binding, but it is a very authoritative legal opinion on the state of international on the subject matter. So that is, I think, now the next stage, to move it forward, to move it through the IMO system.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm sure we'll discuss further with our colleagues at IMO on the submission. I think it's something very interesting. With that, I'll come to Professor Pierre-Jean for his closing comments.
Very briefly, because I think, more eminent people around this table have spoken better than I can. I think there's definitely some progress to this advisory opinion. Obviously, we would have preferred to see some things such as the principle of systematic integration upheld and being a bit even more ambitious, but definitely a lot of progress on through this decision, and definitely noting Professor Kirkhope's suggestion for yet another submission. So that's definitely going to be considered. So thank you, Professor.
With that, I'd like to thank our panelists for coming and taking time to speak on this, and also our Ocean Commissioner for his opening remarks. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending. And with that, we're just over time a little bit. I'd like to end the webinar. Thank you everyone for attending. Good night, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. If you're going to work, enjoy work today if you can. And for those going to sleep, good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.